Good morning. I'm Karen DuBois-Walton, and I'm exploring a run for mayor of the great city of New Haven. Before getting to my prepared remarks, I briefly want to offer my thoughts, prayers, and commitment to action to all our neighbors in Brantford yesterday who were impacted by gun violence. We must commit to change. More must be done. My heart breaks over and over again. The story of Dante Wright, killed by police outside of Minneapolis on Sunday, April 11th, just a few miles from the site of the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of Mr. George Floyd. His story reminds us of the reasons that we took to the streets right here at home last spring and summer, demanding police accountability and reinvestment in our communities. I look at Dante and I see a young man the age of my youngest son. I weep with his mother. Too many in our community feel this pain. Yesterday, my husband posted on his social media about the worry he feels for our sons, young Black men. And then I read comment after comment of people who were sharing these same worries. We must act to stop this pain. It was almost a year ago that New Haveners took to the streets in outrage over the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the latest in a too long list of Black lives taken at the hands of police. That was last June. And now here we are, April 2021, almost a year later, on edge, waiting to see the outcome of a trial of the officer who knelt on his neck. April has come to be a significant month for this movement in this community. April is the anniversary month of the police killing of Malik Jones in 1997, and the Yale and Hamden PD 2019 shootings of Stephanie Washington and Paul Witherspoon. These heartbreaking local examples remind us that these are not incidents that happen elsewhere, but are things that happen right here in our community. The activism in our community last spring, along with activism across our state, facilitated passage of work that our own Senator Gary Winfield has advanced for years. In special session, he and his colleagues ushered in a wave of police accountability reforms that were long overdue. And in that work, and through local activism, there was a real opportunity for significant change. Changes that sadly, to this date, have not been made in New Haven. Changes that have the very real ability to save lives when they're enacted. But to be honest, concerns about police misconduct are not the only thing that worries me when I think about the safety of my two sons, and of your children, and of our community. The level of community violence keeps me up at night as well. My heart breaks for every life lost to gunfire in our community. This week, our neighbors in Hartford suffered the unimaginable when gunfire took the life of a 3-year-old boy and a 17-year-old in 2 different incidents this past Saturday. But we do not have to look beyond our city limits to see the loss of life in our community due to gun violence. 20 homicides occurred in our city in 2020. And already in 2021, we have lost 9 lives. Most of these were due to gun violence. Families in our community are shattered. Our communities are suffering. We must act now. We must treat gun violence as the public health epidemic that it is. We must bring the same urgency to address this public health epidemic as we've brought to addressing COVID-19 in our community. Why link these together? The call for police accountability on over-policing and the tragic level of gun violence in our community. We know that poverty and crime are inextricably linked, and we know that we don't solve crime through over-policing. Fundamentally, the gun violence in our community and the centuries-long over-policing of our community come from the same place: historic underinvestment. This underinvestment manifests as lack of access to opportunity, inadequate educational resources, poor access to jobs, low wage and poorly benefited jobs, limited workforce development, and limited neighborhood community economic development. Our community's pain and distress is evident, and we must act. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The federal government is pouring millions of dollars into New Haven. Estimates are that we will receive over $90 million in Rescue Act funds, money that could be spent addressing the very inequities that lead to over-policing, community violence, disproportionate COVID spread, and more. This money must be spent in ways that are driven by the community and reflect investment in the community. We call on the mayor and city leadership to dedicate $10 million of the Rescue Act funds specifically to address police accountability and the prevention of gun violence. We demand an inclusive and equitable process be implemented to allocate those funds towards the following real needed solutions. First, we must invest in community-led efforts to disrupt violence and in community-driven healing and restorative practices. Our community has been leading in this work, as shown by so many of our neighbors in New Haven, including the Bereavement Care Network, the Connecticut Violence Intervention Program, the work done by Chaz Carmen and Ice the Beef, the work done by Sport Academy and Sean Reeves, the work done by Black Lives Matter New Haven, the Citywide Youth Coalition, and so many more. This work is of, by, and for community. It builds on community strengths, and it shifts power and resource to those who are most impacted. Second, we must invest in community organizations that can bring civilian partnerships to deal with matters in the community that should just not be police matters. Models exist in our city and nationwide. We can incorporate clinicians into policing. New Haven is home to the evidence-based models developed in partnership with the Yale Child Study Center, which partners clinicians and police. And yet we do not fund these successful models. We should scale to size programs like these and like those offered by Clifford Beers and others to address the need for services for our families across the city. We can also strengthen partnerships with Project Longevity, probation and parole agencies, and with community-based providers who offer resources and opportunities to our returning citizens. And we can fund diverse mental health care, addiction treatment, domestic violence prevention, and other types of interventions where people need care more than engagement with the criminal justice system. Third, we should make targeted investments in models that create opportunity for our community members and provide options to young people, such that turning to the streets never feels like the only option. These include investments in housing, jobs, workforce development, and entrepreneurial opportunities. Our city should invest in the basic needs that we all require. And our city should invest in income stability models, perhaps a universal basic income. Let's use this money to create innovative investment programs that move community members out of poverty. And finally, let's use these funds to enact the police accountability recommendations that this community marched for over a year ago and implement the reforms for which Senator Gary Winfield, People Against Police Brutality, Black Lives Matter New Haven, Civilian Review Board advocates, and others throughout our city called for. Let's revise the rules of engagement and as a community, redefine when we call the police. Let's build up alternate systems for intervention and invest in restorative justice and community-based efforts. Let's also invest in non-armed professionals for calls for service around homelessness complaints, neighbor disputes, intoxication, sex work, and other engagements that don't require an armed officer. Let's revise our use of force policies. Let's fund a task force to engage in a comprehensive review and implementation of the best practices in use of force. Let's complete a deployment study, funding an external review of force numbers for a city of this size. Let's work to implement screening and wellness reviews of officers with a focus on identifying PTSD. Let's incorporate mandatory intrinsic bias, anti-racism, and anti-bias trainings, and use of force and de-escalation training, not as an ends in end itself, as training has so often been treated, but as an ongoing practice for effective relationships with our community. Let's develop pipeline programs to enroll our own, beginning in middle school, implement a public safety academy, and strengthen partnerships with New Haven Promise and area universities. Let's create structure for meaningful community involvement that builds relationship between community and police and fosters common knowledge and understanding. Let's strengthen the newly formed Civilian Review Board and ensure it's able to do its work effectively. and let's strengthen support to officers who adhere to the duty to intervene requirements. Our community has shared these ideas and been working in this direction for years and years now. When we marched last summer, we called for many of these reforms. Action has not been taken, but we have a unique opportunity before us to change the future of this city. Let's not mourn another Dante Wright here in New Haven because we failed to act. Let's not assemble here as in Hartford crying over a baby whose life was taken. And let's not allow 2021's homicide numbers to look like 2020's. Let's use the resources provided to us through the federal government to invest in meaningful change. Will $10 million fund all of these programs right now? No. But $90 million are coming into the city, and a $10 million investment in these worthy causes is a down payment on a debt long overdue. And it's a first step towards a bright future for our city. New Haven, let's have big vision. Let's act boldly. Let's pay up.